All right, welcome back into the podcast. Excited to have this guy on. I have him on just about every year before the Bears face the Detroit Lions because he's from Michigan originally. He is a huge Detroit Lions fan. He is Patrick Meagher from VSiN/DraftKings, hosts daily there. You can catch him there. And of course, on Twitter/X at The Rap Radio. He joins me now. Patrick, Bill Zimmerman, how you doing?
How the tables have turned. I'm just taking a look at the standings right now, and it appears in the North, my Detroit Lions are sitting 7-2, and I've got a team from the Windy City sitting 3-7. We've done this now, Bill, and thanks for having me. We've done this for many years, and it kind of got rote how I would just do the same shtick, one win, one postseason win since 1957. Now, nothing's changed there as far as the Lions, but a little bit of a difference, a bit of a sea change as far as the organizations right now as we join in 2023.
Yeah, no, Detroit's finally on the right path. They're gonna. I'd be shocked if they didn't win the division. To me, that's the most disappointing thing about this season is not that the Detroit Lions are gonna win the division, that they're playing well. Because not that I like Detroit, but I'd much rather have them up there than the Green Bay Packers. So that's an absolute victory for me as far as I'm concerned. But one of my favorite statistics, one of my favorite things is that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers had won the division in the NFC Central/North more recently than the Detroit Lions. And that's going to end this year. And that's such a good factoid that we're just going to lose. That's the biggest disappointment to me.
Is it going to end this year, though? Because just take a look quickly. Remember, the Lions, I'm taking a look at the odds at DraftKings right now. They're minus 1,100 in division in the North. The Vikings are 7-1, the Packers 30, and your Bears sitting 101. So I'm assuming the Bears won't win the division. I'm assuming your boy Jordan Love and the Packers not going to win. However, the Lions have 2 against Minnesota, and they close out with Minnesota. Minnesota on a heater right now. I do think that 7 right now, and Dobbs looks legit. I do think just because there were some leaks in that Lions game against the Chargers. May I read to you the final 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drives for the Los Angeles Chargers? 10 plays, 75 yards, a touchdown, 10-75 touchdown, 10-92 touchdown, 10-75 touchdown, 768 and a touchdown. Can we take this Lions team seriously? And we'll get to the offensive coordinator, who is freaking ridiculous. You and I have texted about Ben Johnson. I'm 45. We're the same age. He is the best as far as just the dance throughout a game, as far as play calling. He's the best I've ever seen. However, this is a team, and I like Dan Campbell. Let me just be very clear. I think he's fine. I think he's starting to learn a few things identity-wise going forward on 4th down, where it was a little whimsical the first year, starting now to have an identity. And you saw him convert on 4 of 5 against Los Angeles. But if I'm to take a team with no pass rush and no secondary serious, and again, Herbert didn't have anything outside of Allen, and he was toying with that defense. Are you ready to say legitimately a team that hasn't won their division since 1991 and since 1957 has one postseason? I know you're laughing, but it's just facts. In a league where there's 32, in a league where every single year you've got 8 new playoff participants, the Lions have one postseason win since 57. With this defense, are you ready to take them seriously?
I mean, serious, if seriously means Philadelphia, Kansas City, that level, no, I'm not ready to take them seriously there. I don't think this team can get to the Super Bowl. I do think this team could maybe upset San Francisco or something like that, get themselves maybe to the NFC Championship game. I don't know. We'll see. I still, even though I see what Ben Johnson is doing with Jared Goff, I see it. I'm impressed. I just can't fully support a 4th quarter game tied Jared Goff in the playoffs and trust him. Have you changed on Goff? Do you think maybe he's that guy?
No. Goff is mid, as the kids say. He's beyond basic. However, he is doing it, and he has the weapons are insane. It's so funny on the broadcast. They inducted Jahmyr Gibbs, and congratulations, into Canton during the broadcast, when a running back that you literally just handed to us is the better running back. He had an explosive 77-yard David Montgomery, 77-yard run for a touchdown. They are Ross St. Brown. Everybody knows, it's not a secret. I like Laporta. The offensive front is a top 3 unit. They are loaded. And maybe we should segue to your man crush. And let's be fair about Ben Johnson. We have to reframe how we think about potential head coaches. Because the dude calls a brilliant offense, we have literally no clue if he can do a completely different job, which is CEO. Like, we know he's 37, 38 years old. We know he went to North Carolina. We know he's a mathematics major. We know that about him, and we know he calls a brilliant offense. But the Chargers are going to be calling. The Bears are going to be calling for Ben Johnson. Teams are going to fire their head coach to try to get Ben Johnson, and we have no clue if the dude can lead a team. But you are convinced that Ben Johnson should be the next head coach of the Chicago Bears. Would you like to explain yourself?
Well, some of this depends on what happens over the next 2 months. But because of that trade with the Carolina Panthers, they are getting really close to almost being guaranteed a top 2 pick. If you have a top 2 pick, you're going to have Caleb Williams or Drake May, right? I assume you would agree with that. I love Marvin Harrison, but the top 2 picks are going to be quarterbacks. If the Bears are there with Justin Fields still being inconsistent, they're going to have to move on. So they're going to be bringing in a quarterback. The head coach that you need to bring in, you have to bring in an offensive guy that you feel can get the most out of your quarterback. Ben Johnson has already proven he can get the most possible out of Jared Goff. They need to develop the number one job. I understand CEO and you have to coach the whole team. I get that. But this next coach, their number one job is going to make sure that the Chicago Bears actually have a quarterback, like a real legitimate top 10 to 12 quarterback in the NFL, something they haven't been able to say since Sid Luckman. Like literally, like maybe Jim McMahon was a top 10 guy when he was healthy for a couple of years there in the mid 80s. Maybe that's about, to me, Jay Cutler was always the quarterback he was the exact pivot point in the NFL. If your quarterback was better than Jay Cutler, you were in good shape. If your quarterback was worse than Jay Cutler, you needed a new quarterback.
That line of demarcation was Cutler.
He was that was it there. So the Bears have never had that guy. That's what they need to do here. They've got to pick the right guy, especially if they have number one. They have to pick the right guy, and they have to develop him. So to me, and then you start telling me, because obviously I haven't watched Detroit Lions football week in and week out, full 60 minutes. I like what I had seen from Ben Johnson in the time that I'd seen him, and you're talking about how well he calls a game. That's another thing the Bears have not had. We thought we were going to have it with Matt Nagy, the Andy Reid, all this. Then we find out that he cannot call a game. He struggled with it. He had to give up play calling twice because he wasn't able to get it done. Luke Getsy's certainly been questionable with some of the things he does. He's certainly a square peg in the round hole of what he's trying to do with Justin Fields. So to me, having that brilliant offensive mind is what the Bears need in 2024.
Okay, this is a Bears podcast, so I think we should have a little conversation. And if you talk about what happened in 2018 with Matt Nagy, what's fascinating is how precipitously everything has dropped off since. I took a look earlier. They were 9th in points. They were 1st in defense. They fell apart year to year. They got worse every single year with Matt Nagy, which is really just indicative of a dude that doesn't have control of the organization. It was time to move on. No problem. I think he went 8-8, and then failed his final year. But I'm going to go to Bill Zimmerman on Twitter, because this was a tweet just a few days ago. And first off, you're mired in just a disastrous situation where your last podcast, and your guests have been great, but you've discussed punt coverage. You've discussed third down scoring for a team that is sitting 3-7. And then finally, it peaks with this quote: if Matt Eberflus is retained as the Bears head coach, I'm totally out as a Bears fan. So it's doubtful that I would remain a fan of them. But let's give them a little more time and see where I'm at. But I'm definitely out. You've been in a bad way.
All right.
For 50. I've never seen you in such a bad way right now.
Okay. There was a bit of truth that I'm not leaving my Bears fandom. That was more poking fun at Matt Eberflus, because that's literally what he said about Justin Fields last week going into the Carolina game.
Okay.
He said, yeah, Justin Fields was out. They're going to list him as doubtful, but we're going to give it another day and see how he's doing. But he's definitely out. Like it was just Matt Eberflus. I don't know if you've heard any of Matt Eberflus' press conferences. They're awful. He is not a good communicator. He botched things with Chase Claypool. He had to fix that. He screwed up the Justin Fields injury. Like he is just it's a headache every time he's at the podium. So that was more to poke fun at Matt Eberflus. I'm very down on Matt Eberflus. There was a tweet I sent at, I think it was halftime of the Kansas City game. That's where I went nuclear and I wanted to fire everybody and basically at the end, and it pissed off Bears fans. And I was just like, get the number 1 pick, but you better be worried because Caleb Williams isn't going to want to play here. Like I was just like, I just went nuclear because that's how frustrating it is, because this season they were supposed to, what I keep saying is they were supposed to be fun bad. Like they weren't going to compete for the division unless Justin Fields went MVP, like, superstar. If Justin Fields had, improved to the point where he was going to be their quarterback moving forward, but, wasn't, MVP level, they were supposed to just improve, right? Fields was going to be fun. He's going to have DJ Moore and Mooney and Claypool and Kmet, and the offensive line we were going to see get better. And Eberflus was a defensive guy, and they invested in the defense. I mean, Edmonds and Edwards and Walker and Ngakoue in free agency. And they've spent now, I think it's what I consider 6 second-round picks on the defense in the last 2 years. They did Gordon and Brisker in Poles' first year. Then they did Stevenson and Dexter, and Zach Pickens was the 64th pick because of that Dolphins losing their pick. So Pickens was the first pick of the 3rd round, but he was in essence the last pick of the 2nd round in most years. And then they just traded a 2nd rounder for Montez Sweat. So they've given up 6 second-round picks for that defense, plus the guys they signed. So you thought everything was going to start coming together. This team was going to win 7-8 games, and it was going to be everybody's pick to be that fun playoff team in 2024. And they came out of the gate so terribly, so disorganized. It was just Matt Eberflus did such a bad job in September that he buried the whole season. And when they were just getting flattened by Kansas City, and all anybody cared about was that Taylor Swift was in the stands that day, it was just enough. I had just that they, basically that Travis Kelce picked the Bears as like homecoming. Like, hey, Taylor, come see me play this crappy team so I can look good, right? Like that's where it just bottomed out for me, the Bears, and I lost it. So yeah, I'm definitely down on him this year.
I will say with Eberflus, and Kaylee Hartong does an amazing job, but you know what I'm about to discuss. So she's very straightforward. He couldn't hear her question coming out of the half in that Carolina game on Thursday night. And when he went with, we got some stuff up our sleeve, I was all in. Because you know what? He's not a natural speaker. He's not an orator. We get it. We do this for a living, and I stink at speaking. But he just got caught. He couldn't hear the question, and he goes, we got some things up our sleeve. And that was, to me, it was hilarious because he just got caught. Look, you're going to move on from Eberflus. I think the big question as we come around back to the Bears and long-term planning, it sounds like you're completely out on Fields. Is that where we're at?
Well, I'm not completely out on Fields, but I don't see a path for Justin Fields to stay here. Like if Justin Fields, whatever team he goes to, assuming it's not like the Minnesota Vikings next year, like to quarterback, I want him to do well. Like I really want him to succeed in the NFL. And I think there's a chance he could. Getsy wants to play this fast, quick game, get the ball out, screens, keep the ball short. That's not Justin Fields is he's going to hold on to the ball too long. He needs a good offensive line in front of him so he can try and make big plays down the field. That's who he is as a quarterback. But with me, here's basically how I see it. Either Matt Eberflus wins enough games and the Carolina Panthers give them like the 3rd pick where they don't have one of those top 2. That's really and Eberflus keeps his job. That's really the only path I see to Fields staying as the quarterback for 2024. Because basically, if they fire Matt Eberflus, and whether it's Ben Johnson or whatever the next coach comes in, and they're trying to decide what they want to do at quarterback, if you're a head coach in the NFL, and I said, like Justin Fields got dealt a bad hand. Like it's never worked for him in Chicago. Some of it is his fault. I'm not absolving him of blame, but a lot of it isn't his fault as well.
Right.
If you're a head coach and you're looking at your quarterback, and in his 3 seasons in the NFL, 2 coaches were fired, and in the 1 season that the coach wasn't fired, they literally had the worst record in the NFL. Are you hitching your wagon to that quarterback?
No.
And that's it. That's the way I look at it. If Eberflus wins a lot of games and Fields plays well down the stretch, yes, he could potentially keep his job, but nobody wants Matt Eberflus to win a bunch of games and keep his job. So if Matt Eberflus loses his job, I don't see any way that a new coach comes in here and says, Justin Fields is my guy.
It's when I looked up and I saw you were discussing punt coverage, I said, you got to take a step back. Like, I know you got to do the pod, but you got to, and it's not good. I do think there is a question that still hangs over the Bears organization, and it's not necessarily, it looks like he's a sophomore in college. I'm not sure after that Sweat move, I'm not sure you have the general manager you need to be making the calls, because that was a now it appears behind it that they had an understanding that he was going to sign long-term, even if they overpaid. But just on the surface, the move they made, I mean, a second rounder is a first rounder. You got 4 years of control. Like, giving up a second rounder for Sweat was wild.
That was a steep price, and we know that's going to be what, the 36, 37 pick. That's going to be a great pick. And, look, there's other defensive ends than Montez Sweat. If Montez Sweat wasn't in Chicago, he was going to be in Atlanta with a contract extension. I'm confident about that. So he wasn't going to just reach free agency, but there were certainly other ways to address edge. Ryan Poles gets to, hang his hat on this Carolina Panthers trade. That is going to end up being highway robbery. DJ Moore is fantastic. They may end up with a better quarterback prospect than what Bryce Young is. Not knocking what Bryce Young is this year, which is troublesome, because literally him and Tyson Bagent played neck and neck.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you can't be the number 1 overall pick and be
eyeball test
with a UDFA.
Test is not kind to Bryce.
Eyeball test is terrible. So they're not going to they didn't get the quarterback. They have no draft capital. Tyreek Stevenson, who looks like he's probably going to be a pretty good corner, was one of those picks. They're going to have, either Caleb Williams or Drake May potentially with this other pick, plus another second rounder in DJ Moore. It's highway robbery for what they got for that pick. So that's where Ryan Poles is really holding his hat. There's plenty of other questionable moves. He gave up the 32nd pick for Chase Claypool, who they literally went 0-12 with Chase Claypool on the team. They never won a game with Chase Claypool. And then literally they got rid of him and they won a couple games. He was awful in that locker room. There's other and this, some of these are positive, but like he guaranteed PJ Walker $2 million and cut him. He guaranteed Alex Leatherwood $10 million, kept him here for a season and cut him. Like, he's willing to make mistakes, but they're still mistakes. So there's issues that Poles has had. Absolutely. He's got pluses and minuses. That's where, as Bears fans, we all keep looking at Kevin Warren and go, is this the guy who's going to start making decisions and, stabilize this organization moving forward? Or is he literally just here to build a stadium? I think he wouldn't have taken this just to build a stadium. He really wanted to be, the decision maker on a big time NFL franchise. But that's the thing. We just don't know what Kevin Warren's opinion is on Ryan Poles, on Matt Eberflus, on any of this. So that, I think for Bears fans, we're all kind of waiting until January, assuming Kevin Warren's going to hit the podium with George McCaskey and talk to the fans and really get his opinion on what is happening with this team.
It can flip quickly. A culture adjustment. We've seen it year to year. We talked about the 50% turnover as far as the post. That's what makes the NFL, whether you want to call it parity or you want to call it competition, it can flip quickly. You're fine. You're in a good spot. You have assets.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, and for the first time ever, like, I look at this and say, all right, if they're going to drop Caleb Williams or Drake May into this situation in 2024, the offensive line, they don't have a center. That's something they can easily remedy. They can go out and get a veteran center. The rest of that offensive line looks pretty darn good. It's really starting to come together. Tevin Jenkins is a mauler when he's healthy. Darnell Wright's great. Braxton Jones looks like a really good pick. And Nate Davis is a solid player. Like, they have an offensive line that it will be able to protect the quarterback. DJ Moore is an asset. Cole Kmet is a great safety valve to have. They could probably get one of these big receivers, even if it's not Harrison. There's a lot. This is a really good receiving class, as you know, and they got some decent running backs behind them. Like, this isn't dropping Mitch Trubisky in 2017 or Justin Fields in 2021. This would be putting a quarterback into especially if they have the right coach there to mold him. This is actually putting a quarterback in a position to succeed, a rookie quarterback in 2024.
What I love about, and I like what you said about Ben Johnson, and what I love about the potential as far as grooming an offense, grooming a quarterback for Ben Johnson, and again, he's the offensive coordinator with the Lions, is did you hear the quotes coming from the Chargers defenders after?
Did not.
Okay. So essentially, they said, we prepared all week for one thing, and they did the opposite. Now, Brandon Staley, who's going to be fired, we understand, but Brandon Staley, he is a defensive dude first, and he had a defense. Ben Johnson was playing chess, and Staley's got his black and red pieces, and he's jumping, playing checkers. They literally said we had prepared all week for one thing, and the Detroit offense did the opposite. So you like that little zag from Ben Johnson? I have no clue. He hardly speaks. The dudes that I know that cover the Lions said he's super smart, super personable, and is going to make a good head coach. He's going to have more options than the Bears.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, will the Bears actually be the situation if Ben Johnson has his choice of 2, 3, 4 jobs? Are the Bears the situation where he goes, I get to pick which quarterback I want. I have pieces in an offense, and this is actually like you go to the Chargers, like it's ready-made with Justin Herbert, but there's issues with that team. And I'm not saying the Bears don't have issues, but the Bears are a potential situation for a coach like Ben Johnson to say, this is where I want to go because I can do what I want to do with this personnel.
So as we head to Thanksgiving 2023, last year, 3-14?
Yep.
Essentially, polls said this is a throwaway. We're trying to get right with the books. And then coming into this offseason where they spent vociferously on defense, and the Claypool thing in real time was weird. Everybody knew there were issues, and I'm not going to go too deep into that. The Montez Sweat trade, giving up second rounders is just not something you want to do, but okay, that's fine. He's a good player. But last year, aberration, you can accept the 3-14, although they started well. This year, you're looking for improvement. Doesn't feel like it, although the quarterback's been hurt, and you're going to make a change. And that's where you're at.
And I think that's where Bears fans are, is there's this, when Ryan Poles addressed the media after Montez Sweat, he didn't say like Matt Eberflus is our guy. He went out of his way to talk about how great Matt Eberflus is. That got everybody nervous. And then Adam Johns, who covers the Bears for The Athletic, does a good job, definitely knows people around Hallis Hall, did an article where he did 10 bold predictions. And number 2 was Matt Eberflus keeps his job for 2024. That made the Bears fan base crumble to the ground. The idea that he could return is just that's where everything is. And I certainly have a hard time believing if this team wins 4 or 5 games that they could even just any way possible look at that and go, we should keep this guy. What I'm worried about is the end of the year. They play the Cardinals at home, the Falcons at home, and then at Green Bay. And I keep staring at the end of that going, there's a 3-game winning streak that is somehow going to wreck Chicago. Because, Atlanta, if they fall out of it, Arizona, who knows? Green Bay, they're terrible. Like, anything's possible. They could, obviously, the Bears are bad. They could lose any of those 3 games. But they got Detroit twice. They got Minnesota, who's come together. That Cleveland defense is stifling. That's the next 4 games. And then these 3 games to finish.
Okay, let me bring up something. Let me bring up identity, because we can there's a parallel with Dan Campbell and Matt Eberflus. So this is year 3. Okay, year 1 was a disaster. The first half of year 2 for Dan Campbell was a disaster. Then all of a sudden,
but was it? I mean, they were losing close games. They were competitive.
They went to Carolina and got punched in the mouth. I won't get into it. But then it wasn't just advanced analytics. It wasn't just covering the spread. It wasn't just numbers. You could start to feel something starting to change. And it wasn't necessarily just the relationship with the players, because that's been overplayed with Dan Campbell. He just started to get comfortable. He just started, all of a sudden, you could tell that he just started to be comfortable in his own skin. And that kind of parlayed itself to the on-field product. And they just went on a freaking heater. Then this offseason, Dan Campbell was a different human being. Dan Campbell, like I said, year 1 and the first half of year 2, his 4th down decisions were YOLO. There was no rhyme or reason. He would go for it on fourth when it made absolutely no sense, whether analytics or feel. And then he's not going for it when you should go for it. This year, he just said, the outside noise doesn't matter to me. This is my identity. The Lions go for it on fourth more than any team in football, and he's just going to continue to do it. He has the offensive play. I mean, they just won a shootout where 80 points were scored. He has a dude that's protecting him and making him look good in that offensive coordinator. However, I will say those that cover the Lions that I know said that the vibe in year 3 from the second half of year 2 is completely different, and management feels good that they didn't bail on him. You know, Matt Patricia was a disaster of epic proportions. We talked about it on this podcast.
Yes, we did many times.
Like when I say the news or the gossip that I heard coming out of Allen Park was as bad as any organization. We've been doing this our whole lives. I've never heard anything with what people felt towards Matt Patricia. The opposite is true with Dan Campbell. So that brings me to this. Can you see all of a sudden a heel turn? Can you see a change where year 3, it starts to, you mentioned the win streak potentially at the end of the year. Could that buoy Matt Eberflus? And my assumption that he's going to get fired is just stupid.
That's the thing. And we just don't know what the vibe is at Hallis Hall. And all of a sudden we hear Ryan Poles and this Adam Johns piece, and that's where Bears fans are a little nervous. I don't know. I just sit there like logically, you can't keep Matt Eberflus if they win, if they go 4-13. You just can't. But, you know, right now, I think the vibe is positive. This was all spoken before the Carolina Panthers game, where they're sitting there going, all right, we're going to beat the Panthers. And like, I think Hallis Hall right now thinks the Bears are about to have a nice finish to the season, right? Their last 8 games, they're 1-0 right now. Maybe they feel they split the next 4 games. They're not going to. Maybe they feel they split the next 4 games, win, and, you know, go 5-3 or 6-2 down the stretch. If that happens, yeah, Matt Eberflus is going to keep his job. And I think maybe that's where the positivity is that Hallis Hall, Poles and Warren and McCaskey are expecting the Bears to have a good finish to the season. I'm not. And if they don't have a good finish to the season, then I think you're going to make a change. And yeah, the defense is playing well. Like you're not going to run the ball on the Bears on Sunday. Detroit's just not going to do it. Like literally in the last 5 games, the Bears are averaging 2 yards per carry.
And he's calling plays.
Eberflus is calling plays because Alan Williams, something bizarre happened and he got fired.
Which is not a great look for him as a CEO. Also, another HR infraction a couple of weeks ago with the
running back coach.
Running backs coach.
Yep.
That ancillary stuff, not great.
Not great. But the defense is playing well. Now, they had a pass rush against Carolina because of Montez Sweat. He didn't record a true statistic, but he had, I think, 8 pressures. Like he got to the quarterback. He didn't have any tackles or sacks, but that opened it up for other players. Can he do that against a good offensive line? We'll see. The Bears pass rush before that game, they had 3 sacks, I think it was, against Carolina, 5 sacks against Washington, and 5 sacks against literally everybody else. Like they just don't have a pass rush. Secondary is pretty good, but when you don't have a pass rush, your secondary is not going to be sticky forever. So I kind of like Detroit to actually get a measuring stick on this defense that's playing better right now, but they whooped the Raiders. They whooped the Vikings without, and I'm talking about defensively. I'm not saying they won the game. They lost it to Minnesota, but Minnesota had 6 points offensively in that game. The defense played really well. They played really well against the Raiders. They played really well against Carolina. They did not play really well against the Chargers. Justin Herbert had all day. So is this just a factor of the Bears defense not playing good teams and looking good? Or have they turned the corner? And this is another piece of the Matt Eberflus puzzle. Has this defense turned the corner, and are they going to play like this the next 7 games? If they do, that's going to be something that he can hang his hat on. But if Detroit puts up 34 points, if Atlanta scores some points, Minnesota with Dobbs and Justin Jefferson back, do they put 27, 28 points on? If this defense starts looking more like it did the first few games of the season, then yeah, everything's going to fall apart for Eberflus.
Hallis Hall, based on what you said, Hallis Hall could look to Detroit and think the exact opposite of what we've been discussing. They could say Matt needs his Ben Johnson, meaning if the rest of the season goes well, and there certainly seemed to be some energy, it's Carolina. But again, I don't know. There was something about that halftime little trick up my sleeve thing. And you saw the joke in the post-game presser where he asked the reporter, what do you have up your sleeve? It did feel like all of a sudden he was just like, oh, he felt. The question I have is, could you go out and find your Ben Johnson, a young, nobody's heard of? Remember, Dan Campbell was calling plays. Ben Johnson was on his staff. He just handed over the play calling duties. So could you justify Eberflus next year if this ends on a high, like it did in year 2 for Campbell? Go find your offensive coordinator with these assets. I don't know. That is Poles has a tough decision to make because he does have the assets. A lot is on the line.
Yeah, and I don't know what the solution is. Bring in Ken Dorsey. I mean, that's the worst scapegoat firing I've ever seen.
Just had the firing last night. The McDermott. I mean, there needs to be a conversation. Like, that is such a stale organization right now, and to fire Dorsey to pretend like that's the issue.
Yeah, pretend
it's
that's
not a great offense. It just schematically. However, that's not the issue.
Yeah. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think that's why with Chicago, you really just kind of need to see how this plays out in the next 7 games, because clearly I don't think any decisions have been made at Hallis Hall. They're waiting to see how this plays out and they can go from there. So if the thing is right now is, at least, from the outside and listening to you, Detroit, even right before they turned the corner and got hot the second half of the season, it felt like they were close. Like, it felt like they were on to something. They just weren't getting over the hump. Chicago, that's what they keep saying at the press. Oh, we're close. But when you watch this team, they're not close. I mean, the Carolina Panthers game was a win, but that wasn't a win. You can't look at that at a coaching staff and be like, we did well. Like, Carolina they're the worst team in the NFL, and you won by 3. And if Bryce Young had picked up 10 more yards, you would have been going overtime. Like, that's not a good football. That's not a victory. By the way, if Eddie Eberflus is not going into Ryan Poles' office and be like, we got that victory. Like, no, you're just like, all right, we won.
By the way, just as a tip to bettors or potential bettors, because everybody's legalizing sports betting, you do realize the Bears closed 3.5 in that game. The Bears shouldn't be a 3.5-point favorite against anybody. That includes Carolina. 3 is the key number as far as games fall on 3 more than any other number when NFL betting, actually college betting as well. Once that went to 3.5, the play was Carolina, and obviously the number landed 3. But back to your assertion about Dan Campbell, and I will say this because now I've talked myself into Matt Eberflus sticking around, which is a disaster over 29 minutes. I will say that, like you said, with Campbell, even though they were losing games, it did feel like they were close. They were losing a lot of tight games. And remember his introductory presser, Bill. He came in and he said kneecaps, but he also said something else. He had no identity. He said, you thought you were getting Matt Campbell, who's been a disaster at Iowa State, but you got Dan Campbell, because he was so uncomfortable, so unsure of himself, so bumbling and stumbling over his words. His approach and his just overall demeanor now is absolutely night and day. I know it sounds cheesy, but I keep on harping on the trick up the sleeve. If Eberflus can go from that presser that he had on Wednesday before the Carolina game. Okay, so just to pick up, if all of a sudden Eberflus can start to feel comfortable, because what you saw with the guy that was saying Justin Fields is not going to play tomorrow against Carolina, Justin Fields might play against Carolina. What was the question? Like, he was so flustered that you just have a guy that had a defensive coordinator with the FBI involved. You had an HR infraction with the running backs coach, and you've got a losing season with no quarterback and no question. Like, you had a guy that was flustered. If all of a sudden he can put something together in the second half, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Hallis Hall keeps him. I just don't know if it's the right decision.
No, I don't think it would be the right decision at all. And that's where, the nerves are a little frayed right now around Chicago Bears fans. So before we wrap up, let me ask you this about the Detroit Lions, because as two teams that have been, neck and neck in terms of misery for basically this entire century, the last, 20 some years. I know the Bears had a couple more peaks than Detroit did, but it hasn't been good. What was the big key for this turnaround for Detroit? Was it Ben Johnson? Was it Campbell's culture? Was it Brad Holmes and the talent thing? Like, what do you think? What do you put behind a team that was, constantly winning 4 or 5 games every year to now, being in the front driver's seat for the division.
I'm going to give you 2 weird answers. The first one is Penei Sewell. Why? Because Jamar Chase was sitting there. Like, remember, that was the conversation that Cincinnati was having. Are we going to go Chase? Are we going to go Sewell to protect Joe Burrow? They ended up going Chase. The Lions go Sewell. Sewell's first year wasn't great, but all of a sudden, the anchor of Decker on one side and Sewell on the other side has really settled down that offensive front and made everything possible offensively. Secondly, Dan Campbell hated Jared Goff. Brad Holmes comes in and makes the trade for Jared Goff. Dan Campbell couldn't wait to move on from Jared Goff until, and I'm not trying to mitigate the quarterback position, until one thing happened. He then elevated Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson has puppeteered Jared Goff perfectly. We saw the puppeteered Nate. We saw he could be puppeteered by Sean McVay on that run to the Super Bowl. Those are my 2 answers. Again, culture starts with Campbell. 2, shoring up the offensive front. And 3, bringing in an offensive coordinator or elevating an offensive coordinator that, to me, dances through a game like nobody I've seen.
All right. So Ben Johnson leaves after this season.
Disaster.
Where it doesn't matter where. He's going to get a head coaching job.
Of course.
What do you think of the Lions next year? I mean, I'm sure it'll be who replaces Ben Johnson. Is
500.
They'll regress that much.
Oh, Dan Campbell's a nice guy. Like my friends that work at the Ford plant in Inkster, they're happy with Dan Campbell. My stepfather, who's lifelong general man, they're happy with Dan Campbell because he feels like Michigan. He feels like Detroit. They won 41-38 in Los Angeles against 2 players, Keenan Allen and Justin Herbert, and a donk, that is a betting term, and Brandon Staley. That was an offensive win. What does Dan Campbell have to do with that? I don't know. We'll see moving forward. He deserves every ounce of credit for having a 7-2 team right now. But between you and I, the credit goes to the offensive coordinator.
All right. Well, you heard it there.
Before we go.
All right. What do you got?
I know you have to go. I have to thank you as a White Sox fan. My mom and those watching on Bally's in Detroit have been subjected to not just bad baseball, and I'm talking all-time bad baseball, but they have been subjected to a bad broadcast. For those that don't know, Mario Impemba and his partner at the time got into a fight during the game, and ever since then, the Detroit booth on television has been a disaster. In Michigan, during the summer, you have that as kind of your companion, riding shotgun. Even if the baseball's bad, you have a broadcast. There is also, I'll use the term again, a dance that you go through during the summer. Jason Benetti, we worked with a guy that's a savant. Mad Dog Chris Russo. Better, he's just good at what he does. I literally put Benetti, who is the White Sox play-by-play guy, in the same category as far as just settling in and getting into a rhythm of a baseball game. I don't know if there's anybody better right now. And the Detroit Tigers somehow paying to get Benetti and Reinsdorf losing him was a freaking mind-blowing tweet when I read it.
Yeah, no, look, that's a nice coup for the Detroit community. He's a fantastic broadcaster.
Great guy.
And he's a great guy. And what's amazing is this was in essence kind of like his dream job, doing the White Sox. He's from the area. It's the White Sox organization is that much of a dumpster fire right now. Apparently, I heard something that Jerry Reinsdorf didn't even like him. He didn't get his sense of humor, which is just terrible.
He's hilarious.
He's fantastic. Him and Stone, that was a great combination. But yeah, the White Sox organization, we could do an entire podcast on that, because that is, as a White Sox fan, that is rough. For me, this stretch, this team, the Tim Anderson, Moncada, this whole Jimenez, this whole core that they put together, being as disappointing as it's been, to me, is the most disappointing in my 45, let's call it 40 years of White Sox fandom. Because my first year I remember them is 83 when they won the division. That's my first White Sox memory. This is the most disappointing stretch of White Sox baseball I've ever had in my life. Those late 80s, early 90s teams not being able to get over the hump, that was bad. But this is brutal. I think a lot of White Sox fans think of that white flag trade when they were 2 back at Cleveland in 95 and traded away all their pitchers. Like, because they weren't beating Cleveland. That Cleveland team was phenomenal. So I that wasn't even it for me. This not being able to put together a winning team with this group of players, that was brutal.
Not to be overly dramatic, but a baseball season is very familial. Losing Benetti is a big deal for White Sox fans. Like, that is, I'm sorry, but that outside of on the field. Last thing before we go, NFC, AFC, would you right now say Eagles Chiefs rematch?
I mean, that's the way you certainly have to lean. I don't see any. I still don't trust the Cowboys as well as they're playing. They seem to be really good at just beating bad teams and then squeaking ones out against good teams. I'm not gonna put any money on Brock Purdy going to a Super Bowl. I'm not saying he can't with that supporting cast. So in the NFC, I think the Eagles are the comfortable team to pick there. The AFC obviously is going to be a lot more of a dogfight and be a battle. But some of those teams that we expected to be there with Kansas City, like Buffalo and Cincinnati. I know Cincinnati was hot there, but it's possible if Cincinnati doesn't get hot again, they don't even make the playoffs. There's enough good teams in the AFC. They could be on the outside looking in. Buffalo's doesn't look like they're getting in. So right now it would be hard for me to pick something other than Kansas City and Philadelphia.
Bill, as we say goodbye, every year I say I'm sorry to America for Detroit on Thanksgiving. As we say goodbye this year, I'd like to say
this year.
I'd like to say you're welcome, America.
and you're welcome, America, for not having the Bears on a national game on Thanksgiving, because I think between the Sunday night football game and the Thursday night football game, and they got a Monday night football game coming up against Minnesota that they announced will not be flexed. I think the national football audience has had enough of the Bears this year.
Godspeed, my friend.
All right, there he is, Patrick Meagher, again, VSiN and DraftKings at the Rap Radio on the Twixter machine. Patrick, thanks for so much time. That was fun. We'll talk to you soon.
Great to see you, Bill. Thank you.